Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Man Overboard 50 Ain't Nothing But a Number, yo, with your host, Language Barrel. Sponsored by the Wolf's Pack, America's by invitation only male friendship, support, and networking group, where the one become many and the many become one. Here, they put the man back in human. Okay, as you can see, everyone, I got my official scruffy beard look. I got my one and only power thinking cap brain stimulator hat on, because these topics are going to require some extreme mental manipulation and mental gyration. And I just got to make sure my hat is in place so that I can respond correctly and appropriately. And the fact that I had to think about these questions so hard and so long, actually, I forgot to shave. Okay. So let's get started with today's show. And we're going to dig into the 3 questions that men fear the most. And okay, if there are any ladies watching, I got to warn you that the first question is not, will you marry me? Nor is it, does this thing get any bigger? And lastly, was it good for you? No, these are not the questions that men fear the most. The questions that men fear the most revolve around self-actualization or self-awareness. And for many men, these questions don't strike them until they get somewhere in their late 40s and early 50s, e.g., IG, known as the midlife crisis. Okay, and so most men don't even recognize that there are these 3 questions. They just kind of know this question about kind of life and meaning. But what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the 3 questions that men really fear to ask themselves. And the first question that men fear to ask themselves is kind of, what is manhood? Like, how do you define manhood? Like, how do you define what it means to be a man? And for me, and this may actually be different across age spectrums and eras, okay, epochs, right? Generations. I'm just fishing for some terms here. And so this actually could be different across generations. I'm a child, I grew up in the 60s, so I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. And so for me, when I grew up, it was pretty clear what a man was, right? A man, you were responsible, you went to work every day, you took care of your family, you came home, you were home for dinner, right? And so you had the final say in the house. You were the leader. You were the head of the household, right? And your wife may or may not have been working. Of course, it would depend on your socioeconomic status. I come from a very economically depressed population. So my father worked and my mother worked. But in some situations, based on your family's income stratum, you may not have had a working parent. Also, part of that is that men didn't cry. Like men, you don't cry if you were a man back in those days, right? If you got hurt, you just kind of walked it off. You got a broken leg or you got your arm chopped off. You didn't cry. You just kind of shook it off, walked it off. Men didn't have emotions. Somehow in the creation, when we got made from Adam and Eve, we got various body parts, but somehow our emotions and sensitivity was stripped out of us. Now, for my father's generation, my father was born in the 20s or 30s. So in his generation, it was even clearer what a man was, right? And so a man was definitely had the final say, right? A man that went every day off to work and came home, provided for his family. Women didn't have very much authority. They didn't have much power. As an example, I can remember growing up. This must have been in actually the 70s. Or early 80s, when we had to move out of our house. We were renting a house, not we, meaning me, and meaning my mother and father, of course, because I was just a child. We were renting a house, and then our house caught on fire. We had some damage in the house, so we had to leave the house to go rent another house. And so we went to the bank went to the real estate office to talk about renting another piece of property. My mother could not sign as the primary leasee on the lease, even though my mother worked 2 jobs and had the more stable of the income. My father was a construction worker and did some hacking, and I guess the hacking term back in those days meaning you drove an illegal cab. So you were Uber before it was Uber. So in the black community, we had Uber long before there was Uber, right? You had men that would hang outside of grocery stores, and for a few dollars, they would take you in your groceries home. You'd pay them money in the hood or in where I lived at. So this was back in the 70s, long before there was an Uber. So again, my father's definition was much clearer and much more restricted than my definition of manhood. And then now my son is in his 30s, and that generation, now their definition is actually going to be much more fluid, right? I think the last statistic that I read a statistic that said that 33% of the women that are in monogamous heterosexual relationships earn more than their partners. So obviously with that kind of change in the financial stratum or situations, as a man, you can no longer base your manhood solely on the fact that one, you are the primary breadwinner, and two, that you are the leading that you are financially totally financially responsible to provide safety and security for the home. Because, and like I said, a third of the cases, the women are actually making more money, right? They're making more bread than the husband. And so obviously with situations like that, your definition is going to have to change and be much more fluid. And this also brings us to like childcare. When I was growing up, my father spent very little time with us. There were 6 of us and spent very little time with us as children. Primarily, the primary child rearing responsibilities was for my mother. That's who that fell upon, even though at sometimes, as I mentioned, she actually worked 2 jobs and actually had the most hours outside of the home working. It was still her responsibility to raise the children. Now, when things came along for my children, I actually spent quite a fair amount of time involved in child rearing with my son and my daughter. I had made a concerted effort that I wanted to be much more a part of their life than my father was a part of my life. So as you can see, even across the different generations, the way we define manhood can be different depending on what stratum or what age or generation you came from. And so that's the first question is, how do you define manhood? The second question is, where did you get this definition from? Who taught you what it means to be a man? Did you read it from books? Did you have the influence of male role models in your home? Was it from your father, your uncles, your brothers? Just to kind of provide some backdrop, in the African American community, there are a large percentage of homes in the African American community that do not have a permanent male role model involved in the home. And so the question would be, for those men, like, kind of, how do you get your definition of man? Where did you learn that from, what it means to be a man? And so if you kind of like me, my father, as I mentioned in a previous blog, was a functioning alcoholic, which meant on weekends he was pretty much drunk or inebriated. So he worked during the day, and in the week he was intoxicated. So you can see that could be a problem as far as child rearing. So I didn't learn. I decided not to take that behavior as role modeling for myself. I don't really drink. I may have a drink once or twice a month. I certainly don't indulge in become intoxicated, and don't really approve or associate it with that behavior or people that actually do that. I generally don't have friends who get drunk and inebriated, or that I hang out with people that get drunk and inebriated. It's just not. It's not a behavior that I can really relate to or appreciate, so I don't do it. So on my part, I've kind of gone the opposite. I'm kind of like my anti-dad, right? So I saw the behavior that he modeled, and I actually modeled the opposite, right? And so the question is going to be, for men, where did you learn what it means to be a man? And so if you're like me, you picked it up from different pieces. You picked it up from your friends, from the street, from books, from trial and error, how you interact with women, what behaviors the woman appreciated, or what feedback she gave you, then you might modify or modulate that behavior based on the feedback you got from her. But it wasn't, for me, it definitely wasn't any one man or group of men that made such a major influence on my life that I decided, okay, here's what manhood is. Here's the way I want to model my manhood. I kind of pieced it together. And I think that's a very dysfunctional way to actually model or piece together your definition of manhood. But that's the way it was for me. That's how I learned what it was to be a man, just from pulling all these different pieces from different behaviors that I saw with other men that I either appreciated or wanted to emulate. And so the second question to you is going to be, okay, you define manhood. Now, who taught you that, or where'd you get it from? Now, the third and most difficult question, and this is really the question that leads into the question, right? This is like the nitty with the gritty, right? This is the down and the dirty. This is the question that really forms kind of who you are and what you will be the rest of your life. And so that third question, depending upon how you answer the first two questions, defining manhood, how I learned this, can be any number of questions that come out of that based on what you think of the first two questions, i.e., e.g., right? So it could be, now that I understood, now I have a definition and can attribute where I learned this definition. Now, what does that mean for me now, right? Do I have to maintain this definition of manhood? Can I change it? Right? Can I grow from this? The person I was in my 20s or my 30s and 40s and my understanding of manhood, do I have to be locked into this same definition of manhood, or can I grow from it? Can I change? Can I take new information and new ideas and form a better me or a better definition of the man that I want to be? Right? That's kind of this third question. So the third question is very amorphous, very fluid, like a Morpheus from the Matrix, right? You're kind of moving around in slow motion and fast motion. And so that third question could be, so what does this mean to me? How can I change it? What impact will this have on my life, right? And why do I have to maintain this definition, this antiquated definition of manhood? Does it serve my best interest? How does this definition of manhood fit with the contemporary definitions of manhood, the contemporary customs and mores, right? The expectation from your partner, whether your partner is man or woman, whether it's gay or straight, right? Because we're all in society, and a lot of the roles that we have are changing based on the women's revolution, right? Based on the power that women have gotten recently, this affects how we define ourselves. And like I mentioned previously, take this 33% of women who earn more than men. And that was a key driver in the way we defined manhood in the past, is how much we made, how much we worked outside of the home. And we could always some men would leverage that to say, well, I can't spend this much time in the home because I spend this much time out of the home. And I made the decision that I want to put my career primary so I can support my family. Well, now there are women that make the same much or more than you, right? And women still have somewhere like 70 to 80% of the responsibility in the home for child rearing. So you have a partner who's making more money than you, doing more of the housework than you, raising more of the children than you. So you can no longer have this definition like I'm the man, right? I'm the man and here are my responsibilities, when this person over here has got those same responsibilities plus additional responsibilities. So it's going to necessitate that you have to do some evaluation of what is a man and how does your manhood relate to what your current partnership situation is. And this not only impacts your private relationship, but it may also impact your public relationships, your business relationships, right? So as I mentioned, my father, people deferred to the man in the business, right? Women deferred to the man because he was the leader. And in certain situations, that's not the case. I worked in a community hospital and worked close with the executive leadership team, or worked in conjunction with the executive leadership team as a hospital quality consultant. And there was a 6-person team, right? The CEO, the vice president of nursing, and you have the chief financial officer, quality director, HR. So you have all these other roles as part of the executive team at this hospital, and 2 were male. 2 were male, and the 4 other ones were female, right? And so you can see how that dynamic shifts, right? Where as if you were part of an older generation, it might have been the expectation as a man that people defer to you. But at this hospital, with 4 members in executive leadership as females, you could not go into that organization with that mindset that these women were going to defer to you, because these women were expertise in their particular field, and they were not going to defer to you, especially if you were a subordinate, had a subordinate role. And so so you can see how in today's society we have to change. And so these are the 3 questions that I think men either are afraid to ask themselves or really don't want to ask themselves, right? Is what is manhood? How did you learn that? And then, so what does that mean, right? How does that modulate or moderate your behavior, right? Your definition of manhood will impact your behavior. And if that definition of manhood is not in sync with the current mores and norms and customs in the present society, then you're going to be bumping some heads, right? You're going to be bumping some heads with people and get this reputation for being a difficult coworker, or providing some type of hostile environment. And so, and also I didn't even get into this whole thing about like emotions, which is this whole like, big thing about men and emotions. About when I was growing up, and even when my father was growing up, men didn't have emotions. Men didn't cry, right? You could have your arm severed and your eyes poked out, with hot coals or hot sticks, and it was expected that you wouldn't cry. You would just like kind of moan a little bit, like that hurts, but you certainly didn't express any emotions. And if you lost significant others in your life, it was expected that you wouldn't cry, that you would just kind of tough it up, or as we used to say in my day, you walk it off. You have your mother die, and people tell you, just walk it off, walk that off. And so you can see why men don't really deal with these 3 questions, because once you start dealing with the questions, then you have to respond to them. And once you understand and start to evaluate, looking at your life to say, here's what I think, here's how I learned it. And then your third answer has got to be, so what am I going to do about it? Do I need to do anything about it? Is it in my best interest to maintain this behavior that I have, my customs, the way I deal with people and interact? Because your beliefs affect your actions, right? It starts with a belief, then it becomes an action. There's an old saying that says that seeing is believing, but now there's a saying that says believing is seeing, meaning that if you believe something, you see it, and then once you see it, you manifest it, you start to take actions to do it. And so your beliefs about who you are as a man definitely will impact your interactions with your children, your significant other, your employers, your relatives, people you encounter on the street. And so you need to evaluate that as a man. You need to evaluate that and say, based on what I believe and based on the way I was taught, are these actions appropriate? Is this behavior appropriate in current society? Another good example is that when I was younger, it was, I don't want to say that it was okay, but it was accepted that men would touch women's bottoms. Like if you were a waitress, like maybe a man would slap you on the bottom or grab your bottom. It wasn't encouraged, but it was certainly, I had certainly seen it multiple times, and it was not out of the norm. And the thinking was that, well, men are just being men. Well, now, certain people can talk about grabbing women's vaginas, but for the most part, most of us can't walk around grabbing a strange woman's vagina and not expecting to be incarcerated or shot. And so you can see how your behaviors and beliefs about how you think and what you think a man are can certainly impact your interactions. And for some men, it can be detrimental. You can be arrested. You can be, and this whole thing and this whole Me Too movement is brought about by some contemporary not contemporary, but by some antiquated ideals about men's rights and what men could do and what men couldn't do, irrespective of what the woman wanted. If the man wanted to do it, he just did it. But now you're starting to see that there are repercussions from that, right? Because now society has changed. Society is redefining manhood. And if you're a man and you're afraid to redefine your manhood, you could be in trouble, or you could be relegated to a much smaller community. So that's all I got for this episode. As you can see, I needed my brain booster hat, and then because the information was so mentally draining, it forces the hairs out, and I didn't have a time to shave because I knew I needed all my energies to combat these deep thoughts. So I'm going to be signing out. I'll see you in future blogs. At the close of my podcast, I usually like to leave people with a little poetry or some words of wisdom. And it goes a little something like this. Puedo correr para atrapar el mundo o reducir la velocidad y espero su regreso. You can run to chase the world, or just slow down and wait for its return.